There are people who follow rules, and then there are people who build their entire identity around making sure everyone else follows them. The guy in this story wasn't on the HOA board, wasn't elected, wasn't hired, and honestly had no real authority over anybody. But somehow he managed to make an entire neighborhood feel like it was living under surveillance. The crazy part is, nobody stopped him for years. Looking back now, I think that's exactly why he kept getting worse. And the night he decided to climb onto my grandfather's property before sunrise, he set off a chain of events that ended with flashing police lights, handcuffs, and a whole neighborhood standing outside watching karma finally catch up. This happened in a small subdivision outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, one of those places where people still wave when they drive past each other and everybody knows whose dog belongs to which house. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, had lived there for nearly 20 years. He was 75 years old, a retired Army mechanic, stubborn as a mule, and probably the calmest man I've ever known. The kind of guy who could listen to somebody yell at him for 10 minutes straight and somehow make them feel embarrassed just by staying quiet. I had moved in with him temporarily after a rough breakup. What was supposed to be a couple months turned into almost a year, and honestly I didn't mind. Life felt slower there. Most mornings started the same way. Grandpa would be out on the back porch before sunrise with black coffee in one hand and an old flannel jacket hanging off his shoulders, watching the world wake up. That's where he was the morning everything started. I remember stumbling into the kitchen around 5:30, still half asleep, pouring cereal into a bowl when I heard the familiar groan of the back fence. At first I thought it might be a raccoon. We had plenty of those. Then I heard would creak again. Grandpa didn't even turn his head. "There goes Ethan again," he muttered. I looked through the window. Sure enough, there he was. Ethan Mercer, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. He was halfway over our fence with his phone already raised, recording video before his boots even touched the ground. The man moved like he was gathering evidence for a federal investigation. His eyes darted around the yard, looking for violations nobody else could see. I watched him walk straight toward Grandpa's vegetable garden. Now, this garden mattered to Grandpa. After my grandmother passed away, growing vegetables became his thing. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, green beans. Every row perfectly organized. Every plant tied up neatly. He spent hours out there every week. Ethan stood over those tomato plants and started taking pictures. Click, click, click. I set my bowl down. What the hell is he doing now? Grandpa took a sip of coffee. Apparently tomatoes are dangerous this week. I almost laughed. Almost. Because with Ethan, there was always a chance he was serious. The guy had spent years harassing people over things nobody cared about. He once measured a neighbor's grass with a tape measure. Another time he photographed Christmas decorations because they stayed up 3 days longer than HOA guidelines suggested. One family got 3 warning letters because their teenage son parked his truck in the driveway instead of the garage. Nobody liked him, but somehow everybody tolerated him. That was the problem. The more people ignored him, the bolder he became. I headed toward the back door. Grandpa stopped me with one sentence. "Sit down." I turned. He jumped our fence. I know. He shouldn't be here. I know that too. So why are we letting him? For the first time, Grandpa smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile a poker player gives when he's holding a winning hand. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "a fool will give you more evidence than you could ever collect yourself." I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not then. But over the next few days, I started noticing things. Ethan wasn't just watching our property. He was obsessed with it. Twice I caught him lingering near Grandpa's workshop. Once I found fresh footprints behind the shed. Another neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly from across the street, mentioned seeing him peeking through side yards while pretending to walk his dog. The whole thing felt wrong. And honestly, it wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. It felt personal. Like Ethan wanted to catch somebody doing something. Anything. Even if he had to invent the crime himself. The strange part was nobody seemed willing to challenge him. The HOA president, Linda Carver, always defended him. Every complaint got the same response. Ethan is just trying to help maintain standards. Help. That word drove me crazy. Because climbing fences isn't helping. Taking secret photos isn't helping. Following people around with a camera isn't helping. But every complaint disappeared into paperwork and excuses. Then one evening, about 3 days after the tomato incident, I walked into the garage and found Grandpa sitting at his workbench surrounded by wiring, tools, and a yellow legal pad covered in notes. He looked up, closed the door. I did. Then I noticed something. There was a blueprint of our front gate spread across the table. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized Grandpa wasn't just documenting Ethan anymore. He was preparing for him, and whatever he had planned, he looked far too calm about it. The next few days felt strangely normal on the surface, but underneath, something was changing. Grandpa still drank his coffee on the porch every morning. The mail still came around noon. Kids still rode bicycles down Willow Creek Drive after school. If you were just passing through the neighborhood, you'd never notice anything different. But I noticed, because every time I walked into the garage, Grandpa was working on something. He never explained much. He'd ask me to hand him a screwdriver, look up a regulation online, or read a section of county code. Sometimes he'd sit there for 20 minutes without saying a word, studying paperwork with the same focus he used to give military equipment back when he was younger. One afternoon, I finally asked him, "What exactly are you building?" He glanced up from the workbench. "A lesson." That was it. Just a lesson. Then he went right back to work. By Friday morning, the project was finished. The front gate looked exactly the same as it always had. Black wrought iron, solid hinges, freshly painted. Nothing about it seemed unusual until you looked closer. Mounted beside the entrance was a bright yellow warning sign. Warning electrified security gate in no trespassing. I stared at it. Then I looked at Grandpa. "You serious?" "Completely." "Is that legal?" He reached into a folder and slid several documents across the table. Permits, inspection reports, county approvals, every piece of paperwork imaginable. "I've spent 6 decades following rules," he said. "If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it right." The system wasn't dangerous. The voltage was low, designed as a deterrent, not a weapon. It was the same principle used on livestock fencing all over the country. The difference was that livestock usually learned faster than Ethan Mercer. The very next morning, we found out. It happened before sunrise. The sky was still gray when I heard movement outside. Grandpa was already on the porch, coffee in hand, rocking chair, moving slowly, almost like he was waiting. I stepped quietly beside him. Across the yard, a shadow appeared. Ethan, right on schedule. He climbed the side fence with surprising confidence, dropped into the yard, and immediately pulled out his phone. I swear the man recorded everything. He moved toward the gate, probably trying to get a better angle on the garden. Then his hand wrapped around the metal. The sound he made was impossible to describe. Half yelp, half scream, 100% panic. His body jerked backward so fast he nearly launched himself into a flower bed. His phone flew out of his hand. One shoe came off. For a brief second, he looked like a cartoon character discovering gravity. I bit down hard on my lip, trying not to laugh. Grandpa never moved, never smiled, never reacted. Ethan scrambled upright, looked around wildly, grabbed his phone, and limped toward the fence. Before climbing out, he turned toward the porch. His face was red, embarrassed, furious. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Grandpa calmly pointed toward the sign. "What part of the warning confused you?" For a moment, Ethan looked completely speechless. Then he climbed over the fence and disappeared. The silence afterward lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then I lost it. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled Grandpa's coffee. Even he couldn't completely hide a grin. "Think he learned?" I asked. Grandpa took a sip. "No." And somehow that answer worried me more than if he'd said yes. Because he wasn't guessing. He knew. The story spread through the neighborhood by lunchtime. Nobody knew exactly what happened, but everybody knew something happened. Mrs. Donnelly claimed Ethan had pulled a muscle. The Petersons thought he'd slipped in mud. A teenager down the street swore he'd seen Ethan sprinting down the sidewalk, holding one shoe. The truth was somehow funnier than every rumor. For most people, that level of embarrassment would have ended things. Not Ethan. The shock didn't humble him. It enraged him. Over the next several days, his behavior got noticeably worse. He started driving slowly past the house multiple times a day. Sometimes he'd park across the street. Sometimes he'd sit there for 20 minutes without moving. Other times he'd hold his phone against the windshield recording. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. Then other neighbors started noticing too. One evening, Mrs. Donnelly walked over carrying a casserole dish. "You boys okay?" "Why?" She lowered her voice. "That man's been parked outside your house for almost an hour." Even she sounded unsettled. And Mrs. Donnelly wasn't afraid of much. The atmosphere in the neighborhood started shifting. People whispered about Ethan more openly. Stories came out. A lot of stories. One neighbor admitted Ethan had photographed her grandchildren playing basketball. Another said he'd taken pictures through a side gate. Someone else claimed he'd been documenting visitors coming and going from houses. Nobody had spoken up before because each incident seemed small by itself. But once people started comparing notes, a pattern emerged. The guy wasn't enforcing rules. He was feeding an obsession. And obsessions don't disappear quietly. They grow. By the second week, Ethan looked exhausted. His eyes were sunken. His movements felt agitated, like he was carrying around an argument that never ended. One afternoon, I caught him standing near the community mailbox area. When he saw me, he smiled. The kind of smile that immediately makes you uncomfortable. "You think this is over?" he asked. I stopped walking. "I don't think about you enough to have an opinion." That hit harder than I intended. His expression tightened instantly. "I'm protecting this neighborhood." "No," I said. "You're stalking it." For a second, I thought he might actually lose his temper. Instead, he laughed. A weird laugh. Forced. Sharp. Then he leaned closer. "Your grandfather thinks he's clever." I shrugged. "He usually is." The smile disappeared. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore. This wasn't about community standards. It wasn't even about the gate. Ethan viewed Grandpa as a challenge now, and challenge had become obsession. That realization sat in the back of my mind for days. Then came a night everything crossed a line. I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy. Storm clouds hung low over the neighborhood, even though no rain ever came. Around midnight, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard a metallic sound outside. A scrape. Soft. Deliberate. Not an accident. Not an animal. Something mechanical. I sat upright immediately. Another scrape. Then another. My stomach tightened. I moved carefully toward the window and looked outside. At first I couldn't see anything. Then a flashlight beam flickered near the front gate. My heart dropped. There he was. Ethan, wearing a dark hoodie, crouched beside the gate. And in his hands was something that definitely wasn't a camera. It was a pair of bolt cutters. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't snooping anymore. This wasn't trespassing. This wasn't some wannabe rule enforcer taking pictures. This was somebody actively trying to break into private property. I spun around and rushed toward Grandpa's room. Before I could even knock, his voice came from behind me. Calm, steady, completely awake. I know. I turned. He was already standing in the hallway, fully dressed, holding his phone. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear, certainty. He glanced toward the front yard, then looked back at me. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Outside, another metallic click echoed through the darkness as Ethan positioned the bolt cutters against the gate. And neither of us knew that within the next 10 minutes, half the neighborhood would be awake. Police cruisers would be racing toward Willow Creek Drive, and Ethan Mercer would finally discover the difference between pretending to have authority and answering to real consequences. The moment Grandpa told me to stay inside, I knew two things. First, he had expected this. Second, whatever happened next was already part of a plan that had been forming long before Ethan Mercer ever showed up with those bolt cutters. I stood near the front window watching through a narrow gap in the curtains while Grandpa stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was silent. No dogs barking, no cars moving, just the distant hum of insects and the faint metallic sound of Ethan working at the gate. He still hadn't noticed Grandpa. That part almost felt unbelievable. A grown man crouched in somebody else's yard after midnight, trying to cut through private property, completely convinced he was somehow the victim in the story. Grandpa sat down in his rocking chair. Actually sat down, like he was settling in to watch a ball game. Coffee mug in one hand, phone in the other. Calm as ever. Ethan squeezed the handles of the bolt cutters. The jaws clamped against the metal. Click, and then everything happened at once. A sharp electrical snap cut through the darkness. Ethan jerked backward so violently he lost his footing. The bolt cutters flew from his hands. His flashlight spun across the grass. For a second, all I could hear was shouting. Then came the panic. Real panic. Not embarrassment. Not frustration. Panic. What the hell? He stumbled backward into the mud, slipped, fell hard, scrambled to his feet, then slipped again trying to run. Grandpa never moved. He simply lifted his phone, recording everything. Every second, every step, every word, every terrible decision. Ethan finally spotted him on the porch. "You psychopath," he screamed. Grandpa took a sip of coffee. "You planning to explain the bolt cutters?" That only made Ethan angrier. He started shouting about HOA authority, community inspections, public safety violations, every excuse he could think of. The problem was none of those excuses made sense anymore. Not when he was standing in someone else's yard after midnight. Not when he had bolt cutters. Not when warning signs were posted clearly on the gate. Most importantly, not when everything was being recorded. Then Ethan made the mistake that finally ended everything. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This man attacked me," he yelled. "He's got an illegal electric fence. He tried to hurt me." Even from inside the house, I could see Grandpa shake his head. Not out of anger, out of disappointment. Like a teacher watching a student fail an open book test. The police arrived fast. Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed across the houses lining Willow Creek Drive. Doors opened. Porch lights came on. People started stepping outside. The entire neighborhood seemed to wake up at once. 2 officers approached the gate. Ethan rushed toward them immediately, talking fast, pointing, gesturing wildly, trying to control the narrative before anyone else could speak. One officer listened patiently. The other walked over to Grandpa. "Sir, can you explain what happened tonight?" Grandpa handed him the phone. "Sure can." The officer watched the video, then watched it again. Neither officer said much during the playback. That silence probably scared Ethan more than any argument ever could. Eventually, one of them looked up. "So let me get this straight." Ethan immediately nodded. "Exactly. He assaulted me." The officer pointed toward the screen. "That's not what I'm asking." The neighborhood had gone completely quiet. Everybody was listening. The officer continued. "You climbed onto private property." Ethan said nothing. "You ignored posted warnings." Still nothing. "You brought bolt cutters." Silence. "You attempted to damage a secured gate." More silence. And then called 911 claiming to be the victim. The expression on Ethan's face changed. For the first time all night, confidence disappeared. Reality had finally arrived. And reality wasn't interested in his version of events. The second officer asked one simple question. "Were you authorized by the HOA board to conduct inspections?" Ethan hesitated. That hesitation said everything. "No." "Were you authorized to enter private property?" "No." "Were you authorized to damage private property?" "No." The neighborhood seemed to exhale collectively. Years of frustration condensed into one moment. One truth. One undeniable fact. The guy had never had authority. He had simply acted like he did. A few minutes later, the handcuffs came out. The sound of metal clicking around his wrists echoed through the street. And something happened that I'll never forget. Someone started clapping. Nobody knew who started it. Maybe Mrs. Donnelly. Maybe one of the Peterson kids. Maybe somebody standing in a bathrobe halfway down the block. But one pair of hands became 2, then 5, then 10. Soon the entire street was applauding. Not because someone was getting arrested. Because a problem that had poisoned the neighborhood for years was finally being confronted. Ethan looked stunned, like he genuinely couldn't understand why nobody was supporting him. The cruiser door opened. He was guided inside, and just before they closed the door, he looked toward Grandpa. I expected anger. I expected threats. Instead, I saw confusion, as if he still couldn't figure out where things had gone wrong. The police cars pulled away. The flashing lights disappeared. Neighbors slowly returned home, and the street became quiet again. A different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm finally passes. Grandpa stood up from his chair. For a long moment, he stared down the empty road. Then he said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. People think power comes from telling others what to do. He paused. It doesn't. I waited. It comes from being responsible for your actions when things go wrong. Then he walked inside. The legal fallout lasted months. Trespassing charges. Property damage charges. False reporting. None of it happened overnight. But Ethan's reputation never recovered. More importantly, neither did the illusion he had built around himself. Because that's the thing about fake authority. It survives on assumptions. The moment people stop assuming, it collapses. Looking back, I don't think the story was ever really about HOA rules. It was about boundaries. The physical kind and the personal kind. It was about what happens when someone mistakes patience for weakness, when they confuse silence with permission, when they become so obsessed with controlling other people that they stop controlling themselves. Now here's the part that still sparks arguments whenever I tell this story. Some people think Grandpa should have confronted Ethan much earlier. Others believe he waited too long. Some say the gate taught an important lesson. Others say it escalated the situation. Even today, neighbors disagree about where the line should have been drawn. And honestly, maybe that's why this story sticks with people. Because underneath the drama, the police lights, and the handcuffs is a question every community eventually faces. How much bad behavior should people tolerate before somebody finally says enough? So now I want to hear your opinion. If someone like Ethan lived in your neighborhood, what would you have done? Would you document everything like Grandpa? Would you confront them directly? Would you involve the police sooner? Or do you think both sides could have handled things differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where people draw that line. And if you've ever dealt with a self-appointed rule enforcer, an HOA bully, or someone who acted like they own the neighborhood, share your story too. Read through the other comments, compare experiences, and let's see how many people have met their own version of Ethan Mercer.